Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing the Ryzen 3 1200 overclocked to 3.9 GHz with the GeForce GTX 1060 6GB on many games. As you can see there, into the BIOS, Ryzen 3 1200 quad core, 3900 MHz on the processor, and the RAM is at 2933. I cranked it up to 3900 and 1.25 on the voltage. It says SMT enabled, but it doesn't do anything since this processor doesn't have SMT, so it doesn't matter if it's on or off. Then Windows 3.89 GHz, 4 cores, 4 threads, all that stuff. And then on the memory we have 2 sticks of 4 GB of RAM at 2933, but it says 2934. So first we start with Battlefield 1 multiplayer on 1080p, as you can see there. I'm using FOV 90 degrees, and in the advanced settings I'm using a mix between high and ultra, just mesh quality on high, the rest on the highest possible, so we're using pretty much ultra settings. So yeah, mesh quality was down there to help the CPU get less stressed, and as you can see in the bottom left corner of the video there's a graph, and those spikes you saw there were stutters. So yeah, there are stutters in this game, as you can see, there are many every now and then. That's mostly due to the CPU and RAM, it seems. The game itself uses around 5 GB of RAM, of system RAM. Then you gotta take into account the rest of the system, Windows, background applications, all that kind of stuff. So we got a total of 8 GB of RAM, the game is using 5, and Windows and background programs are using a little bit more, so we only have 0.8 GB free. Overall, the game is playable. I was playing it in the past when it first released in worse conditions than this, and it was totally fine. My recommendation is to lower mesh quality further, lightning quality, and cap the game at 60 frames per second so the CPU has an easier time playing the game. CSGO 1080p once again, and I'm using pretty much the highest settings without any MSAA or FXAA. If you want to use MSAA, the frame rate will be very similar since we are having low GPU usage, so keep that in mind. I'm using a mod which is a benchmark. It always runs through the same place. It's pretty much a stress test. So you will see a very high GPU usage when we are going through smoke. Remember that this is the old smoke, so it's more demanding than the smoke of the actual game. So yeah, we got a lot of NPCs doing animation, a bomb exploding, a lot of smoke, an open area, all that kind of stuff. So this should be taken as a stress test. The game itself should perform better. This should be the worst case scenario. Fallout 4 1080p TAA. I don't really like how it looks, but it's a personal opinion, I guess. Then we're using ultra on most of the things. God rays will be on low, shadow distance on high, only lens flares will be enabled, and then on distant object detail and object detail fade only on high instead of ultra. So I'm in a very tall place in the city, just looking down. I'm going to take the elevator. and I'll just run a little into the city and head outside and just kill everyone or as many people as I can in this game, and that should do. You'll see that the GPU usage is quite low, sometimes 60%, since this game isn't running that well on AMD's CPUs anyway, so don't expect 60 frames per second constant, expect drops as low as 40-45 frames, at least in this area. But yeah, so far it's still playable, at least in my opinion, and this is how the game runs.
Who needs a haircut? Everyone needs a haircut. Step up.
Move along.
Hey, swata, 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 swata! Swing, swata!
The hub of trade for all Diamond City right here.
Self-prescribed chems, as recommended by me.
Nothing to see here.
And I.
GTA 5, I'm going to be using 1080p, all the sliders maxed, and I'm going to be using pretty much a mix between very high and ultra, which most of the settings are on its max possible except grass and a couple other things. And on the advanced graphics I'm using long shadows and high detail streaming while flying. So my objective here is to again stay over 60 frames per second. So I'm going to be just flying into the chopper. I'm going to land in the middle of two big streets, and I'm going to start exploding cars, fighting with the police, all that kind of stuff. And you'll see the frame rate like around 4 or 5 times can drop below 60 frames per second just for an instant each of those times. That's only when I'm exploding like more than 3 or 4 cars at once. Seems to be the reason why the frame rate is dropping. But I recommend just lowering shadows and the post effects option. If you lower those two from very high to high, you should have no problems maintaining over 60 frames per second, since those options also use a little CPU for what I could see in the past. But yeah, so far the game is running pretty good. Outside of those big explosions of many cars at once, the game is over 60 frames per second. Assassin's Creed Unity, once again 1080p, and I'm going to be using pretty much a mix of very high and high. As you can see, environment quality on very high, textures on the maximum, shadows on high. Since soft shadows have a big impact in performance, I'm using HPAO Plus and well, FXAA. And as you can see now, I am in Paris, going through a lot of NPCs. And the thing that you will notice first when I attack the first enemy is that the frame rate will drop very drastically, like a big stutter. That seems to be just the game loading new assets or something like that, since it happened to me even using the Ryzen 5, i5s, i7s, all that kind of stuff. After that, there is not much of a drop anywhere to be seen. It's between 50 and 60 frames per second, but you can see some CPU bottleneck, so the CPU's limiting factor here will drop around 80%. It's on very specific places, and we are over 60 frames per second very often. Overwatch, once again 1080p, and I'm using the highest settings. I'm using Epic on graphics quality, and on the advanced options I'm using the highest settings. And there's not much to say about this game. It runs totally fine. I'm over 90 frames per second pretty much all the time. Sometimes it might drop, but it didn't drop below 60 frames per second. You will see that the CPU usage is very high, sometimes at 100%. That's due to the very high frame rates. So if you just want lower CPU usage, cap the frame rate at 60 or something like that. That should help you have lower temperatures on the GPU and CPU, since both will be used lower.
I've done it.
I've got you in my sight. Experience tranquility.
I've got you. I'm taking care of you.
Step right up. Hello.
Let me get you patched up.
Enemy sighted.
Where does it hurt?
I need healing.
Justice reigns.
The Witcher 3, 1080p as you can see there. And I'm going to be using pretty much a mix between high and ultra. The only things lower were number of background characters, grass density, and foliage visibility range. Those were lower to high. And on post-processing, I used pretty much everything max, except in ambient occlusion, which I kept on SSAO, and chromatic aberration was turned off, since I don't like the effect, and it doesn't have much of an impact in performance. And I'm testing Novigrad, since it's one of the most CPU intensive places that I know of so far in this game. And yeah, the game is running pretty much at 60 frames per second and over, but when you get into the middle of the city, when there are many NPCs, there's some fire there, all that kind of stuff, it can sometimes drop to 50, but it's at very specific place, so yeah, it's very playable.
Oh, could you? Oh, right. Ah.
Chance to surrender unorthodox bugs. Bars and tracks for streaming the sacred flame especially.
All riders.
That's it, Roach.
The thinking customer will see right away.
Not so fast, Roach.
On a pilgrimage to the temple of the eternal fire.
Hey-ya!
Batman Arkham Knight 1080p. I'm using the highest settings, and as you can see, the maximum frame rate possible is 90 frames per second. You can unlock the frame rate further by just going into a config file, but personally I just prefer to keep it at 90 frames per second max, since that helps to have lower CPU usage. For example, when you're just on a rooftop or flying on a big open area with not much detail, the game might go at 90 frames per second and then suddenly drop to 60 or 40. So I just recommend sticking to the 90 frames per second cap, or just put a 60 frames per second cap so the CPU has less of an issue maintaining the frame rate. As you can see, when I'm fighting it's fine. When I move the camera very subtly, the game can drop from 80 to 50 or something like that, below 60 frames per second. And when I'm driving the Batmobile, it can be even worse. There are stutters pretty much all over the place. So yeah, keep that in mind. This game, in my opinion, just stutters by default. Even with an i7-4790, I had stuttering issues. Some people say that more RAM can help. I can assure you that, but it doesn't fix the game, unfortunately. Also, an SSD can help to load the assets faster, so the game stutters less. But overall, it's quite bearable.
Batman! It's not a freaking tank! Oh, God! Come on, get us out of here! Look out, Batman's here! Is there anywhere left that ain't been looted? I'm getting bored.
Escape from Tarkov closed beta. I'm using 1080p, and on the settings I only lowered the object visibility, since that's one of the things that hits the frame rate here the most, and I turn off screen space reflections. And I'm into a factory level, and well, this is one of the places where I had some drops previously on the 1050 Ti in places with a lot of lights. There seems to be a heavy use of ambient occlusion, which also can have a big impact in the GPU. That's why the 1050 Ti struggled more with this game. But yeah, so far it's over 60 frames per second without much of a problem. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds 1080p, and in the quality settings I'm using a mix between medium, high and ultra. The only thing on medium is effects, close to 60 frames per second with some drops every now and then, but at the beginning of the gameplay you'll see me just in a rooftop waiting. Well, I'm going to kill someone in a motorcycle from a distance, and after that this place will become a red zone, which is a zone that will just be air bombed, so there will be a lot of explosions. Well, when those explosions show up, you'll see a lot of drops below 60 frames per second, and I'll show you in this video how to fix it. Just lower effects from medium to low, and the frame rate drops when explosions show up will be gone, will be again over 60 frames per second. So my recommendation, just lower effects from medium to low, and you should be pretty much over 60 frames per second. After that, I'll just show you myself driving a motorcycle through this town you see here. And that was a hit to the frame rate too. I had some drops below 60 and some stutters every now and then. So that seemed to be a better task than just standing there waiting, since we're just loading assets and moving fast through the map. So yeah, it's not running bad at all. It's a very good experience so far. Just Cause 3, 1080p, SMAA, and I'm using LOD factor and shadow quality from very high to high to have a better frame rate, trying to stay over 60 frames per second. And well, as always on Just Cause 3, I'm going to jump from an helicopter, land close to a gas station, blow up that gas station, then fly around in the city to the next gas station, blow up that gas station as well, then I'll fly away once again and start just fighting with the military, exploding some cars and all that kind of stuff. And you'll see drops below 60, stutters, all that kind of stuff, but keep in mind that this game uses a lot of RAM and it also uses a lot of CPU. You'll see this same problem using i5s, Ryzen 5, all that kind of stuff. At least on my channel, the videos I made on this game, on those processors, I had the same issue, even using more RAM. But at least with more RAM, you got less stutters than you will see in this video. So yeah, it's not essential to have more than 8 GB, but if you can, it will be better. It will be a little better with the stutter department.
Reports of hostiles in the area. All units respond. Engaging the target. All units converge on the following coordinates.
Rise of the Tomb Raider, 1080p on DirectX 12. As you can see, I'm not using anti-aliasing, but you can use FXAA or SMAA if you don't mind losing a couple frames. Shadows will be on very high, texture quality on high, sans of shadows enabled, ambient occlusion, all that kind of stuff. I turn off tessellation to get some extra frames. And as you can see, it's pretty much a mix between medium and high settings with level of detail on medium to help the CPU handle the game better. And as you can see in this village area, this place is called The Village. It's one of the places where I have the highest CPU usage, so one of the most demanding parts of the game. And as you can see, I drop below 60 frames per second quite often, but if you move slower, it will drop below 60 less often. So if you're running around the map, you'll see just the game dropping below 60 more often. But yeah, in my opinion, it's still totally fine to play. We're above 50 frames per second, which in my opinion is smooth enough already. So yeah, not a bad experience at all.
I understand. I'm just glad you were there to vouch for me.
My people have spent decades fighting outsiders. It's not an easy habit to break. See if you can lend a hand with the preparations. A little hard work would go a long way towards building trust.
I'll see what I can do.
Doom 2016, I'm using 1080p, TSS-AA, FOV 130 degrees, the Vulkan API, and I'm using the highest settings except in shadows, which instead of nightmare will be an ultra. So I'm using the highest quality textures, but the shadows will be just instead of nightmare on ultra, which I don't notice much of a difference, to be honest. The game looks still amazing. And as you will see, it will be pretty much over 60 frames per second pretty much all the time. Sometimes you might see a stutter or two. That seems to be due to the CPU. Due to the higher frame rate, it will be more difficult to the CPU to keep up with the GPU. That's why sometimes you will see a stutter or two, but it's not bad. I'd recommend just playing it like this. It happened like a couple times in half an hour, so in my opinion it's not that bad. But if you want to solve it, just cap the frame rate to something lower and you should be fine. And finally, Forza Horizon 3. I'm using 1080p with the latest patch. That's why the threaded optimization option is there, which allows multi-core CPUs to be used better. And I'm using a mix between medium and ultra, pretty much. As you can see, static geometry and dynamic geometry quality will be on medium, both of them, to help the CPU. I'm using 2x MSAA, and then world car level of detail on high, the rest of the options on ultra, and the environment texture quality on high, since ultra textures have a big impact on the GPU, since they are way higher quality than the ones on high. And well, as you can see in the game itself, we are getting pretty much over 60 frames per second. It's running very well, but on the first turn to the right, you might see a drop below 60 frames per second to 57 frames. It's not bad. I mean, you barely notice it if you don't have an FPS counter. It's just 3 frames below 60. But if you want higher frame rates, you might want to just turn off MSAA. It will help a little bit, since as you can see, the GPU usage varies quite a bit. It's between 90% and 70%. You'll see it fluctuate here and there. And you might see a stutter or two in the gameplay. It's just for an instant, so I take it as acceptable. But yeah, if you want to avoid those stutters, plus the game being more consistent, I recommend capping the game at 60 frames per second, so the CPU has to do less stuff. But yeah, so far totally playable. I have no complaints on this one. So conclusion time. Yes, we can play many games at 1080p 60 frames per second and over that target with the Ryzen 3 1200 plus the 1060 6GB. Please keep in mind that the Ryzen 3 1200 was overclocked to 3.9 GHz, and I highly recommend you to do that if you own a Ryzen 3 processor, since they are very easy to overclock. I just cranked up the voltage to 1.25 volts and then cranked up the frequency to 3.9 GHz. And it worked just fine. Even with stock cooler, I was getting very good temperatures. You can check links down in the description for Random Gaming in HD and J2Sense videos on Ryzen 3. Both of them overclocked to 3.8, 3.9 GHz on the stock cooler. And they were getting very good temperatures, just like I did. So yeah, if you have a Ryzen 3 processor, just overclock it. You have no excuse. Just make sure to have a B350 motherboard in order to be able to overclock. Check the one I use down in the description, it's very cheap. But yeah, some games had trouble hitting consistent 60 frames per second, like Battlefield 1, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Fallout 4, Just Cause 3 and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. But we were very close to that target. You can just judge that by watching the video itself. But yeah, in my opinion, it's worth it. You can even overclock the GTX 1060, and on GPU intensive games use even higher settings, like on Witcher 3 or Assassin's Creed Unity. So yeah guys, if it's worth it or not, that's up to you. I'm making this video so you can build your own opinion by watching the benchmarks. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.